Now let's look at value returning functions. A value returning function is a function that when you invoke it, it does something, but then it returns information to wherever it was called from. And you've already been using value returning functions, like the rand function. So if I cout rand, I'm going to call this rand function. And I have to include that library. And if I run this, you can see our intro function was called, right? It was a void function, so it just executed and then returned back to line 12. And then on line 14, we printed out the returned value of the rand function. So this was a void function. It just did something. But this function, when we called it, did something and then returned information back, which we then printed to the screen. And I'll go ahead and remove this. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these statements and put them in a value returning function, and we'll probably call it prompt user. And when we call that function, it will prompt the user for an integer and then validate it to make sure that it's a positive integer. And then as soon as it's a positive integer, it will return that integer. So I'm going to go down below main and I'm going to write my function right here. So remember the three parts for the function. We have to have the return type, and since we will be prompting for an integer, we're going to be returning an integer. So it's a return type of int, and then let's just call this prompt user, and then we have our parentheses, and then I'm going to create my block for my function. Okay, this is the function header, and then this would be the block where I will put my statements. So I'm going to go up here, copy all of those, or actually cut those out, and put them into my prompt user. Okay, and then I will just call prompt user. And so we have to add a few more variables in our function. So when you create a function, functions can't have access to other functions' variables. So we've declared num up in the main function, but our prompt user function doesn't have access to num. So this is going to fail if I try to compile it because there is no num variable declared in prompt user. So I'm going to go ahead and create a num variable and I'll initialize it to 0. Now keep in mind this num variable is different than this num variable. Each of the functions, main and prompt user, have a num variable, and those functions don't know about the others' variables. We call this a local variable. It's local to this prompt user function. This variable has local scope. That's what we call it, scope, because it's only visible within this function. So I'll go ahead and prompt the user. I'll read it in. I'll make sure it's positive. As soon as it's positive, I'm going to return that value. So I'm going to return num. So all value returning functions must have a return statement. And whatever type of function you declared, you have to return that type of data. So since this is an int, the type of data that I return has to be an int. If this were a car, the return variable would have to be a car. These two things must match. So when the num is returned, I have to put it somewhere. So I'm going to store it in main's variable num. So prompt user will execute. It'll get a valid positive integer. It will return it, and then I will put that value into num. So we're almost ready. but we have to do one more thing, and that's add the function prototype. So int prompt user, like that. I'm going to go ahead and run my program. And you can see that it's waiting for me to do a positive integer. I'll put -9, not positive, try again. How about -8? Nope, not positive, try again. 9. And 9 is odd. So the prompt user code executed when I called it in this statement, just like when I call rand, it executes and then it returns a random number. Well, this function, prompt user, executes, but it returns a positive integer that the user has entered.